You're just a burden pretending this house is yours. Louise's sharp voice carried from the entrance hall as she adjusted her designer scarf while pointing out some decorative details to her real estate friend. This garden needs a complete overhaul. Maybe by the time we return from our trip, you'll have finally found your own place. I stood frozen by the rose bushes, my gardening gloves covered in spring soil, the pruning shears hanging limply from my hand. The roses my mother Margaret had planted decades ago had just begun their first bloom of the season, their delicate pink petals unfurling in the morning light. "This is my house," I said quietly, my voice steadier than my trembling hands. "Mom left it to me. You know that, Joseph." Louise rolled her eyes dramatically at her friend, as if we were performing a well-rehearsed routine for her audience. "Here we go again with that fantasy. Tell her, Joseph." My father's jaw tightened as he approached, avoiding my gaze. At 62, his once dark hair had faded to steel gray, and new lines had appeared around his eyes since Mom died. "Your mother wanted us all to live here as a family, Claire, not for you to lord it over us." "Legally, I'm still." "Legally what, Dad?" I challenged, straightening my back, feeling a surge of courage I rarely displayed. "What exactly are your legal rights here?" He checked his watch, a nervous habit he'd had for as long as I could remember. "We're going to miss our flight. Sophia's already waiting in the car." The front door closed behind them with a heavy thud, leaving me alone amid the half-pruned roses my mother had so carefully cultivated before cancer took her 5 years ago. "My name is Claire Wells. I'm 54 years old, and despite what my father and stepmother believe, I am the legal owner of this Queen Anne Victorian home in suburban Philadelphia. My mother made sure of that, placing the property in a trust with me as the beneficiary following her death. What I want is simple: respect for my mother's wishes and acknowledgement of my rightful ownership. Standing in my way are my father, who has conveniently forgotten the trust terms, and Louise, my stepmother of 3 years, who treats me like an unwanted houseguest in my own home." I took a deep breath and walked to the large bay window, watching their luxury sedan back down the driveway. My stepsister Sophia, 20, sat in the back seat, her camera raised briefly toward the house before she lowered it quickly, not wanting her mother to notice. They were headed to the Bahamas for 10 days, a family vacation from which I had been deliberately excluded. "You understand, Claire," Louise had said with false sweetness when the trip was first mentioned. "You have the garden to tend to, and someone needs to watch the house." As their car disappeared around the corner, I felt a familiar mixture of hurt and anger rising in my chest. At 54, I shouldn't still feel like the excluded child, yet here I was, fighting back tears in the garden. I had tolerated their dismissive behavior for years, telling myself it was what Mom would have wanted, for us to remain a family despite her absence. I returned to the roses, my hands still trembling slightly as I carefully trimmed a damaged branch. Gardening had become my refuge, the one place where I felt connected to Mom, where her presence seemed to linger in every plant she had selected and nurtured. I had just finished the last of the pruning when my phone buzzed in my pocket. A notification appeared on the screen, an email from Louise to my father, accidentally copied to my address. "Joseph, I've spoken with Robert. He says once we're back from vacation, we can move forward with having Claire legally removed from the house. He thinks her claim about Margaret's wishes won't hold up without the original trust documents." My stomach dropped like a stone. I sat heavily on the garden bench, my mother's favorite spot to watch the sunset. Who was Robert, and what did Louise mean about the original trust documents? With growing unease, I realized the situation was far worse than I had imagined. My mother, Margaret Wells, was a brilliant community activist who had spent her career preserving historic homes and neighborhoods in Philadelphia. This house, a Queen Anne Victorian built in 1887, had been her crowning achievement and greatest love. She purchased it as a crumbling foreclosure when I was just a child, pouring her heart and savings into its restoration. My childhood memories are filled with community meetings in our living room, the smell of varnish and paint, and my mother's infectious excitement about saving another piece of history. Dad never shared her passion. An accountant by trade, he tolerated what he called Margaret's expensive hobby, but complained constantly about the costs and disruption. Their marriage had been strained for years before Mom's diagnosis, but they stayed together, creating a facade of family harmony that I only fully understood as an adult. When mom learned her cancer was terminal, she made careful arrangements for the future. I was 49 then, already divorced for a year, finding my way back to independence after a 30-year marriage that had slowly suffocated my sense of self. Between chemotherapy sessions, mom consulted with attorneys, set up the trust, and had long conversations with me about her wishes for the house. "This will be yours one day," she told me, her thin hand tracing the intricate balusters of the main staircase. "Your father can live here as long as he needs to, but the house belongs to you. Promise me you'll preserve it." I promised, of course. What I didn't anticipate was how quickly Dad would move on after her death. He met Louise at a fundraising event barely a year after Mom's funeral. 6 months later, she and Sophia had moved into our home, bringing with them modern furniture that clashed with the Victorian aesthetic and an attitude that suggested they were doing me a favor by occupying my father's house. Initially, I tried to accommodate them. I was still grieving and grateful for any semblance of family. Louise made occasional efforts at friendliness, though these moments always felt performative rather than genuine. Sophia remained distant, buried in her photography or sequestered in her room. Dad changed after they arrived. He began referring to Mom's carefully curated antiques as that old junk and suggesting we modernize rooms that had been historically restored. When I objected, citing Mom's wishes, he would grow distant and cold. "Your mother is gone, Claire," he'd say. "The living need to come first." I could have moved out, found my own apartment. Sometimes I asked myself why I stayed in a home where I was increasingly made to feel unwelcome. The answer was simple. This house was Mom's legacy to me, her final gift. Walking away felt like betraying her memory, like admitting that at 54, I still couldn't stand up for myself. So, I endured the subtle digs, the exclusion, the gradual erosion of my place in what should have been my home. Now, staring at Louise's accidentally forwarded email, I wondered if my patience had been a mistake. With my father and Louise now thousands of miles away, I decided to use their absence to search for answers. Who was Robert, and what did Louise mean about the trust documents? I started in my father's home office, a room that had once been my mother's sunroom. The transformation was symbolic of the larger changes in our house, her warm, plant-filled retreat, now a sterile workspace dominated by Louise's organizational system. I hesitated at the door, feeling like an intruder despite being the property's rightful owner. "This is ridiculous," I muttered to myself, squaring my shoulders. "I'm 54 years old. I shouldn't be sneaking around my own house." The desk drawers yielded nothing unusual. Office supplies, bills, a few family photos with me conspicuously absent. I noticed a recent picture of Joseph, Louise, and Sophia at some resort, all smiles and vacation clothes. My father looked relaxed in a way he rarely did at home. I turned my attention to the filing cabinet, methodically working through folders labeled with Louise's precise handwriting. In the back of the bottom drawer, I found a thick manila envelope labeled Wells House Legal. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it, spreading the contents across the desk. Inside were copies of documents I recognized. The trust agreement my mother had established, naming me as beneficiary and my father as a lifetime tenant with specific conditions. But there were also newer papers I'd never seen. Correspondence with someone named Robert Greene, a real estate attorney, discussing strategies to invalidate the outdated trust and establish clear ownership. A yellow sticky note in my father's handwriting read, "Original trust documents in Margaret's old lockbox." Claire might have key. Cold understanding washed over me. They were looking for the original trust documents, likely to destroy them. Without those papers, it would be my word against my father's about Mom's intentions. As I continued reading, the depth of the betrayal became clear. My father had been consulting with this attorney for months, seeking ways to claim the house outright. Louise was actively involved, suggesting they could argue that Mom had been mentally compromised when she established the trust due to her medication. The most recent letter from Robert outlined their strongest case, claiming that I had violated the trust conditions by interfering with Joseph's quiet enjoyment of the property, a bizarre inversion of reality that made me the antagonist in my own home. I sat back, papers scattered around me, a strange numbness replacing my initial shock. My father wasn't just forgetting my ownership. He was actively plotting to take my inheritance, to erase my mother's final wishes. How could you, Dad? I whispered to the empty room, my voice cracking. The betrayal felt physical, like a blow to my chest. Almost mechanically, I gathered the documents and returned to my bedroom. From the back of my closet, I retrieved a small fireproof box, my mother's final gift to me. Inside was the original trust agreement, exactly where she told me to keep it, along with a sealed envelope I'd never opened, marked in case of disputes. My hands shook as I broke the seal. Inside was a letter in my mother's handwriting and a business card for Helen Fisher, trust administrator. My darling Claire, the letter began. If you're reading this, then Joseph has forgotten his promises to me. I hoped he would honor my wishes, but I've prepared for the possibility that he might not. Helen has the power to enforce the trust terms if necessary. The house is yours, sweet girl. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. All my love, Mom. I ran my fingers over her familiar handwriting, tears blurring my vision. Even from beyond the grave, she was protecting me, anticipating threats I couldn't have imagined coming from my own father. I should have been relieved to have this safeguard, but instead, I felt a profound sense of loss. Whatever remaining illusions I had about my father's character had been shattered completely. The parent I thought I knew, flawed, but ultimately caring, was a fiction. Though I now had the means to protect my inheritance, I wasn't yet ready to use it. I needed time to process this betrayal, to decide how to move forward without destroying what little family I had left. I carefully returned everything to its hiding place, my mind racing with questions. How long had he been planning this? Was his relationship with Louise somehow connected to his designs on the house? And most painfully, had he ever truly accepted Mom's wishes, or had he been biding his time from the beginning? The next morning, I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring at Helen Fisher's business card. The morning light streamed through the stained glass panels my mother had lovingly restored, casting colorful patterns across the antique wood. After a sleepless night, I'd come to a decision. This stops now, I said aloud to the empty kitchen, my voice sounding stronger than I felt. I dialed the number on Helen's card. After explaining who I was, I heard a warm, professional voice respond. I've been wondering when I might hear from you, Claire. We arranged to meet that afternoon at her downtown office. Helen turned out to be a no-nonsense woman in her mid-60s with silver hair and piercing eyes that reminded me of my mother's. Her office walls displayed framed newspaper clippings of various historic preservation victories, and I recognized my mother in several photos, standing proudly alongside Helen. Margaret and I were friends since college, Helen explained, noticing my gaze on the photos. We fought many battles together to save this city's history. Your mother was the passionate voice, I was the legal muscle. She settled behind her desk and reviewed the documents I'd brought. Margaret was very thorough in establishing this trust, she explained. The conditions of your father's tenancy are quite specific. He may reside in the home rent-free for his lifetime, provided he acknowledges your ownership and doesn't interfere with your rights as beneficiary. He's been doing the opposite, I said, sharing the evidence I'd found. He's actively trying to invalidate the trust. Helen's expression darkened as she studied the papers from my father's office. This attorney Green is taking an aggressive approach. Have there been other issues besides denying your ownership? I hesitated, then described the increasing hostility, the systematic exclusion, and the most recent incident before their vacation. As I spoke, I realized how much I'd normalized their behavior, how I'd diminished my own feelings to keep the peace. I see, she made careful notes. Verbal abuse and creating an inhospitable environment for the beneficiary would also violate the terms. Your mother anticipated potential conflicts and built in protections. What kind of protections? I asked, leaning forward. As trust administrator, I have the authority to enforce the conditions, up to and including terminating your father's right to occupy the property if he's in substantial breach. A mixture of relief and anxiety washed over me. Here was the solution, but at what cost? Evicting my own father seemed extreme, potentially destroying any chance of reconciliation. I don't necessarily want to kick him out, I admitted, fidgeting with my wedding ring, a habit I hadn't broken despite 8 years of divorce. I just want him to respect Mom's wishes and treat me with basic decency. Helen nodded sympathetically. Let's start with a formal letter reminding him of the trust terms. Sometimes a legal reality check is enough to correct behavior. This approach seemed reasonable, firm, but not nuclear. Helen drafted the letter while I waited, outlining my father's obligations under the trust and requesting a meeting upon his return to discuss ongoing compliance. This should be waiting for him when he gets back, she said, handing me the envelope. In the meantime, document any further communications or incidents. If he escalates rather than complies, we'll need evidence to take stronger action. I left feeling cautiously optimistic. The letter would serve as a wake-up call without permanently damaging our relationship. Perhaps once my father understood that his plans with Robert Greene wouldn't succeed, he'd accept reality, and we could rebuild some semblance of family harmony. That evening, that evening, I decided to venture into my mother's old sunroom, a space that Louise had declared wasted and relegated to storage. Dust covered the wicker furniture and potting benches. My mother's gardening books stood in neat rows on shelves, untouched since her death. I ran my fingers along their spines, remembering how she would consult them before planning each season's plantings. In the corner sat several boxes labeled in my mother's handwriting: Preservation Campaign 1990s, Community Action Files, Historical Research. I opened one at random and found myself facing a younger version of my mother in a newspaper clipping. Local activists save historic district. Read the headline. There she was, arm in arm with Helen and other women, standing defiantly in front of a row of Victorian homes. I sat cross-legged on the floor, losing myself in my mother's life work. I found minutes from community meetings, impassioned letters to city officials, and detailed research on architectural features. In one folder, I discovered a journal. Opening it, I realized it was from the year my mother turned 54, my exact age now. Spoke at the city council meeting today, she had written. My voice shook, but I had to stand up for what's right. The developers want to tear down grandmother's neighborhood for another shopping center. I won't let them erase our history. My phone chimed with a text from Louise. We need to talk about your behavior while we're gone. Joseph is very upset. Expect changes when we return. Attached was a photo of my father's office. The desk drawers partially open. Papers not quite as I left them. They must have installed cameras before leaving. Something I should have anticipated. My intrusion had been discovered. Shortly after, an email arrived from my father. I'm deeply disappointed in your breach of privacy. Searching through my personal documents shows exactly why you're not responsible enough for home ownership. We'll be consulting with our attorney immediately upon our return. My heart raced as I forwarded both messages to Helen, my hands shaking. Her response was immediate. This changes our approach. Their aggressive stance suggests they won't respond reasonably to the letter. I recommend you allow me to exercise the trust enforcement provisions. Now, in plain language, she was suggesting I authorize the eviction process, the nuclear option I'd hoped to avoid. Before I could reply, another email arrived, this time from Robert Greene directly. Miss Wells, I've been retained by Joseph and Louise Wells regarding the disputed property at 1847 Chestnut Avenue. Please cease any communication with my clients and direct all future correspondence to my office. Be advised that we are preparing legal action regarding your unfounded claims to the property. My heart sank as I realized my cautious, measured approach had backfired. By giving them warning, I'd only accelerated their plans. The hope I'd felt earlier evaporated, replaced by the sickening certainty that this conflict was heading toward an irreparable break. Mom, I whispered to the empty sunroom, surrounded by the artifacts of her life's work. What would you have me do now? I picked up her journal again, turning to a later entry. Sometimes standing your ground means losing people you love. But if we don't defend what matters, who will we become? In that moment, sitting among my mother's things, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I was my mother's daughter, and at 54, the same age she was when she fought her biggest preservation battle, I would find the courage to defend what she had entrusted to me. The next morning, I called Helen to discuss our options. Her advice was clear and firm. Claire, your father has engaged legal counsel who's already taking an aggressive stance. This suggests they intend to move quickly once they return. We need to respond with equal decisiveness. What exactly are you proposing? I asked, a knot forming in my stomach as I paced the kitchen, where so many family meals had once been shared in happier times. I recommend we petition the court for an emergency enforcement of the trust provisions, including a restraining order preventing your father and his wife from re-entering the property pending a full hearing. A restraining order? Isn't that extreme? The words caught in my throat. I never imagined I'd be considering such measures against my own father. Not in this context. Their communications show clear intent to violate the trust and potentially remove you from your rightful home. The restraining order would simply maintain the status quo until a judge can review the full facts. I continued pacing, my reflection passing in and out of the antique mirrors that lined the hallway. Each one had been carefully selected by my mother to enhance the period details of the home. They're on vacation for 8 more days. Do we really need to act so quickly? The timing works to our advantage, Helen explained patiently. Filing now gives us time to secure the order before they return, preventing a potentially volatile confrontation. Remember, they don't know you've contacted me or that you have the original trust documents. Her logic was sound, but the emotional weight of the decision felt crushing. This wasn't just about property rights. It was about severing what remained of my family. Let me think about it, I said finally. After hanging up, I wandered through the silent house, running my fingers along the walnut banister my mother had lovingly restored, examining the stained glass window she'd commissioned to replace a broken original. Every corner held her memory, her vision of what this home should be. I found myself in Sophia's room, surprised by its contents. Unlike Louise's sleek, modern aesthetic, Sophia had surrounded herself with vintage elements that complemented the house. On her walls hung framed photographs, her own work, I realized, capturing architectural details of our home. The curve of a banister, morning light through stained glass, roses in the garden. They were beautiful, revealing an artistic eye and appreciation I hadn't known she possessed. On her desk sat a portfolio. I hesitated, then opened it, finding more photographs of historic buildings around Philadelphia. There was real talent here, and a sensibility that reminded me of my mother's eye for beauty in forgotten places. My contemplation was interrupted by another notification, a banking alert I'd set up after my divorce, making me cautious about financial movements. To my shock, my father had remotely initiated a wire transfer from our shared household account, the account I primarily funded for utilities and upkeep, to Robert Greene's law firm. He was using my own money to finance his legal attack against me. This final betrayal crystallized my decision. I called Helen back immediately. I'm ready to proceed, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. What do you need from me? The next few days passed in a blur of legal activity. Helen filed the emergency petition, gathered affidavits, and compiled evidence of my father's actions. My role was to document the home's condition, catalog my mother's restorations, and prepare a statement about the trust creation. Between these tasks, I continued exploring my mother's preservation files, finding comfort and strength in her words. I discovered photographs of her addressing city council meetings, standing firm against developers who threatened historic neighborhoods. In her journal entries from her mid-50s, I recognized my own struggles with confidence and purpose. Sometimes I wonder if I'm foolish to care so much about these old buildings, she'd written. But they're more than wood and stone. They're our stories, our history, our connection to those who came before. 3 days later, 3 days before my father and Louise were due to return, Helen called with unexpected news. The judge has granted our petition, she said. But there's a complication. In reviewing your mother's original will and trust documents, we discovered something significant. What kind of something? I asked, sitting down at the kitchen table, my hand instinctively reaching for the locket I wore containing a small photo of my mother. Your mother added a provision we weren't aware of. If your father remarried, the trust required him to either purchase your half of the property at market value or relocate within 1 year. I sat stunned, trying to process this information. He was supposed to buy me out after marrying Louise? Yes, the provision was triggered 3 years ago when he married Louise, but it appears he never disclosed this to the trust. Margaret wanted to ensure you wouldn't be forced to live with a stepmother who might not respect your position. The implications hit me all at once. So, not only was he violating the terms by denying my ownership, but he's been in breach of the trust for 2 years by not buying me out or moving. Exactly. And there's more. Margaret left a sealed letter with my office to be opened if this specific provision was violated. My heart raced. What does it say? I think you should read it yourself, Helen said. Can you come to my office this afternoon? Helen's office hours later. I sat in Helen's office, my mother's letter trembling in my hands. The familiar handwriting blurred through my tears as I read her final message to me. My dearest Claire, if you're reading this, Joseph has remarried and chosen to remain in our home without honoring the trust terms. I wish I could say I'm surprised, but I've always known his attachment to the house was more about possession than appreciation. What Joseph doesn't know, what I never told anyone, is that the funds for purchasing and restoring our home didn't come from my salary alone. They came primarily from my grandmother's inheritance, with the specific condition that the property remain with the women of our family. Joseph has no legal claim to the house beyond what I granted him in the trust, which he has now violated. I've instructed Helen to help you claim what is fully and rightfully yours. The house is your legacy, your heritage, not just from me, but from generations of women in our family who fought for spaces of their own. Stand firm, my brave girl. At 54, I found my voice. You will find yours too. All my love, Mom. I looked up at Helen, who had been quietly waiting while I absorbed this revelation. She knew, I whispered. She knew he might do this. Helen nodded. Your mother was a remarkable woman. She could see clearly what others often missed. This changes everything, doesn't it? I asked, carefully folding the letter. Your father has no claim whatsoever on the property. None? Helen confirmed. Margaret made certain of that. She was 54 when she fought her biggest preservation battle, I said, more to myself than to Helen. The same age I am now. Yes, Helen smiled gently. She often said that was when she finally found the courage to speak her truth, no matter the consequences. Legal preparations. Armed with this new information, Helen and I revised our legal strategy. Rather than simply enforcing the trust conditions, we would pursue complete termination of my father's tenancy rights based on multiple breaches, denying my ownership, creating a hostile environment, attempting to invalidate the trust, failing to comply with the remarriage provision, and misusing household funds. The restraining order is now in place, Helen explained as we finalized the paperwork in her office. They won't be able to enter the property when they return. The sheriff will serve the formal eviction notice at that time, and will proceed with a court hearing for permanent resolution. I nodded, feeling oddly calm despite the enormity of what we were setting in motion. What kind of timeline are we looking at? The temporary order lasts 30 days. The hearing for permanent resolution is scheduled for the third week, which gives your father time to secure new housing arrangements. As I drove home, I contemplated the practical aspects of this abrupt transition. Most of the furniture was my mother's, documented in the trust inventory, but my father and Louise had added their own pieces. Sophia had her own bedroom filled with personal belongings. I would need to make arrangements for them to collect their possessions under supervision. The unfairness of disrupting Sophia's life weighed on me. Despite our distant relationship, she was an innocent bystander in the adults' conflict. I decided to pack her things myself, carefully and respectfully, to minimize her distress. I spent the evening in my mother's sunroom, which I had begun clearing and cleaning. I'd found more of her journals and photographs, arranging them on newly dusted shelves. In a way, I was reclaiming this space just as I was reclaiming the house itself. As dusk fell, the room took on a golden glow, and I could almost feel my mother's presence beside me. Unexpected call 2 days before their scheduled return. I received an unexpected call from a Bahamas phone number I didn't recognize. Is this Claire Wells? A young female voice asked. Yes. Who's calling? I replied, puzzled. It's Sophia. Her voice sounded strained. I need to talk to you about something important. Surprised, I asked. Aren't you still in the Bahamas with your mom and my dad? I am, but I'm calling from the hotel phone. I don't want them to know. She paused. I heard them talking last night. They were fighting about the house and about you. My stomach tightened. What did they say? Joseph said their lawyer thinks they can get the house if they claim you're mentally unstable or something. Sophia's voice dropped lower. Mom suggested they could make it look like you're dangerous to be around. They talked about planting something in your room when we get back. I don't know what exactly, but it sounded bad. The revelation stunned me. They were planning to fabricate evidence against me? Potentially something to suggest I was dangerous or unbalanced. It was a desperate, despicable tactic. Thank you for telling me, Sophia. That was brave of you. It didn't seem right. She hesitated. And I heard other stuff too about how the house is actually yours, not Joseph's. Is that true? Yes, I said simply. My mother left it to me. There was a long silence. They never told me that. Mom always said it was Joseph's house and you were just living there until you got your life together. Another pause. I'm sorry for how they've treated you. Her unexpected empathy brought tears to my eyes. It's not your fault, Sophia. None of this is. I should go before they notice I'm gone. But I wanted you to know. Her voice suddenly sounded younger, vulnerable. What's going to happen now? I'm not sure yet, I said gently, not wanting to alarm her with details of the restraining order. But I'll make sure you're taken care of, I promise. After the call ended, I immediately contacted Helen to relay this new information. This changes things, she said grimly. If they're planning to fabricate evidence, we need to take additional precautions. I'll contact the court about modifying the restraining order to prevent them from entering the property under any circumstances, even to collect belongings. We'll arrange for a court-appointed supervisor for that process. I agreed with her assessment, but a new worry had emerged. What about Sophia? She's just 20. She shouldn't be caught in the middle of this. We can request special provisions for her in the court order, Helen suggested. Perhaps supervised visits or a neutral exchange location for her possessions. As we discussed these modifications, another call came in, this time from my father directly. Against my better judgment, I answered. Claire, he began, his voice falsely warm. We've been thinking about our conversation before we left. Louise and I want to apologize for our harsh words. We'd like to have a family meeting when we get back to discuss everyone's needs fairly. The sudden change in tone confirmed Sophia's warning. They were setting me up, trying to get me to lower my guard before they return. That sounds reasonable, I replied, matching his artificial warmth. We definitely have a lot to discuss. As soon as the call ended, I turned to Helen. They're planning something specific for when they return. We need to be ready. She nodded grimly. Don't worry, we will be. Day of return. The day of my father and Louise's return dawned clear and bright, a stark contrast to the storm about to break over our family. As instructed by Helen, I had vacated the house temporarily, watching from across the street as the necessary parties assembled on the front lawn. The sheriff's deputy, Helen in her role as trust administrator, and a court representative to document the proceedings. I sat in my car, hands gripping the steering wheel, my mother's locket cool against my skin. I'd spent the past 2 days transforming her sunroom from a storage space back into the vibrant hub of activity it had once been. Her preservation photos lined the walls, her journals displayed prominently on the restored wicker table. It was as if her spirit had reclaimed the space. Their taxi pulled up at precisely 2:15 p.m. I watched my father emerge first, his face relaxed from vacation until he spotted the official vehicles. Louise followed, designer sunglasses hiding her initial reaction. Sophia hung back slightly, catching my eye across the distance with a small, almost imperceptible nod. From my position, I couldn't hear the exact words exchanged, but the body language told the story clearly enough. The sheriff stepped forward, officially serving them with a court order. My father's posture stiffened in shock, his hand reaching for the documents. Louise ripped off her sunglasses, gesturing wildly as she presumably protested. Helen remained calm, pointing occasionally to specific sections of the paperwork. The court representative took notes and photographs, maintaining an official record of the proceedings. As the reality of their situation became clear, my father's face transformed, first purpling with rage, then draining to ash-gray disbelief. Louise's reaction was more volatile, her arms flailing as she shouted at the officials, then turning accusingly toward my father. I had imagined this moment differently, perhaps with satisfaction or vindication. Instead, I felt a complex mixture of sadness and resolution. This wasn't a victory to celebrate, but a necessary ending to enable a new beginning. At 54, I was finally standing my ground, just as my mother had done at my age. The final blow came when Helen handed them the last document. My mother's letter explaining the true origin of the house funds and the generations-long female inheritance that preceded me. My father sank onto one of the suitcases, the facade of righteous indignation crumbling into stunned defeat as he finally understood the depth of his miscalculation. The house had never been his to claim. It had always unequivocally been mine. Weeks later, in the weeks following that decisive confrontation, the practical matters of separation proceeded with formal precision. My father and Louise secured an apartment across town, collecting their personal belongings under court supervision. Our communication was limited to terse emails regarding logistics, the warmth of family irreparably damaged by betrayal and legal intervention. The most surprising development came from Sophia. 2 days after the eviction, she contacted me, requesting to meet at a local art gallery. They've been fighting constantly, she confided as we wandered among exhibits of urban photography. Mom blames Joseph for not telling her the truth about the house. Joseph blames her for pushing him to take legal action. She hesitated before a photograph of an abandoned Victorian similar to our home. I was wondering if I could visit sometimes. The house. It feels more like home than anywhere we've lived. Her request touched me unexpectedly. Of course you can, Sophia. Anytime. She became a regular visitor, initially for weekend afternoons, eventually staying overnight in her old room when tensions at the apartment became unbearable. She showed me her portfolio of architectural photography, and I recognized in her the same eye for beauty and history that my mother had possessed. Despite our differences, we formed a tentative bond, two people collateral damage in the chaos of our parents' choices. My father attempted reconciliation once, arriving unannounced on a Sunday morning while Sophia was photographing the garden. I met him on the porch, unwilling to invite him inside just yet. I never meant for things to go this far, he offered awkwardly, looking older and smaller than I remembered. After your mother died, I just couldn't accept that she hadn't trusted me with the house. It wasn't about trust, Dad, I replied, feeling a calmness I hadn't expected. It was about legacy. Mom wanted to ensure the house remained in the family for generations. He nodded slowly, looking past me to the entryway where my mother's favorite mirror still hung. I understand that now. Too late, I suppose. Maybe not too late for everything, I said, surprising myself with the offer. But we need time. Perhaps someday we would rebuild some version of a relationship. But for now, the wounds were too fresh, the betrayal too profound. As for the house, I threw myself into continuing my mother's preservation work, focusing on the third floor renovation she had planned but never completed. Sophia's eye for design proved invaluable, her photography documenting each stage of the restoration. Each restored molding and carefully chosen fixture honored my mother's vision and strengthened my connection to the women who came before me. I also began opening the home for small community meetings, reviving my mother's tradition of hosting local preservation activists in our living room. At the first gathering, Helen raised a toast to Margaret, whose vision lives on through Claire. The house has always known who it belonged to, Helen remarked during a quiet moment as we sat in the garden my mother had planted. Your mother would be proud of how you've protected her legacy. She was right. This wasn't just about ownership. It was about honoring the past while building my future, exactly as my mother had intended. At 54, I had finally found my voice, just as my mother had found hers at the same age. And in doing so, I had reclaimed not just a house, but my place in the world. Yes, I said, watching as Sophia photographed the evening light falling through the trees onto the Victorian facade. Mom always said we don't really own these old houses. We're just their caretakers for a while. I'm ready for that now.